So this video covers the basics of plane trigonometry. And one of the first things that we would encounter in this subject would be your right triangle. So a right triangle is any triangle that has a right angle. So when you say right angle, it means that it is a 90-degree angle. So when you think about right triangles, I hope that the first thing that would come up in your minds would be the Pythagorean Theorem. So I hope you can remember this formula. So c squared is equal to a squared plus b squared. But we need to know the definition. Which one is c and which one is a and which one is b. So from the definition of the Pythagorean theorem, let's read here. So in any right triangle, the square of the longest side, which is called the hypotenuse, equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides. So it is important to remember that the c being mentioned here in this formula is the hypotenuse. Alright? So let's move on to your functions of a right triangle. So we have mnemonics to remember the functions of a right triangle. So we have SOHCAHTOA and Tau Cha Sho. Alright. So I have this right triangle right here. So you have C as a hypotenuse. I've already labeled it. And then you have B as the adjacent side relative to theta. So, itong labels na to, this is all in relevance to your theta. So, B is the adjacent side relative to theta, and A is the opposite side relative to your theta. Now, this will reverse if we're going to consider beta. So, when considering beta or relative to beta, your B now would be the opposite side. And then your A now would be the adjacent side. So, depending kung ano yung angle na kina-consider natin. In this case, we're considering here the angle theta. So, balik tayo sa functions of a right triangle. So, let's start first with your sine theta or SO. So, SO stands for sine opposite over hypotenuse. So, SO of theta, SO theta, or sine theta, opposite A over hypotenuse C. So, you have here A over C. So, then we have cosine theta, which is ka adjacent over hypotenuse. So, B over hypotenuse, C. And then we have tangent theta, which is TOA, that is opposite over adjacent. So, we have opposite over adjacent, A over B. Okay, so the next three functions is just the reciprocal of the first three functions that we discussed. So, for example, you have your cotangent. So, the cotangent is just the reciprocal of your tangent. You would notice that it is just reversed. So, instead of opposite over adjacent, it becomes adjacent over opposite. Same with your secant. So, this is the reciprocal of your cosine. That instead of having adjacent over hypotenuse, you have hypotenuse over adjacent. And then you have your cosecant, which is the reciprocal of your sine. It becomes hypotenuse over opposite instead of opposite over hypotenuse. So basically, what you really need to remember is your SOHCAHTOA. And just remember that this sine and cosecant are just the reciprocal of each other. And then you have your cosine and secant, the reciprocal of each other. And then you have your tangent and cotangent, the reciprocal of each other. So kahit ito lang yung tandaan nyo, and then, just remember na yung sine, ang kapartner niya yung cosecant, yung cosine, ang partner niya yung secant, and then the tangent, ang partner niya cotangent. So, babalik na rin nila. And just a reminder, this is only applicable to right triangles. So, that's one of the most common mistakes that some of the students can do, that they apply these functions, these trigonometric functions, to other types of triangles. Alright. So, let's proceed with identities. So, identity, what is the definition of identity? So, identity is a type of equation which is satisfied with any value of the variable or variables while equations that are satisfied by some value or values of the variable are called conditional equation. So an example of a conditional equation is something like this one. So you have x squared minus 4 is equals to 0. So this is a conditional equation. Why? Because it is only true if your x is equal to plus or minus 2. So conditional lang siya. It is only true if, so this equation is only true if your x is equal to plus or minus 2. So ang tawag sa kanya is a conditional equation. Now, an example of an identity is this one. So, let's say sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta is equals to 1. So, whatever the value of our variables, in this case, your theta, it will always be true. So, this is an example of an identity. So, perhaps another example of a conditional equation. So, how about this one? Sine theta is equal to 0.5. So, this is an example of a conditional equation. Why? Because this is only true if your theta is equal to 30 degrees or 150 degrees. So, those are the definition of an identity. Alright, so let's discuss some basic identities. So, let's check out tangent theta. So, tangent theta, TOA, is opposite over adjacent. So, you have A over B. If we divide the numerator and the denominator by C, such as it becomes A over C over B over C, what would happen is that yung A over C natin, ano yung A over C natin? It is sine theta. And B over C is equal to cosine theta. So, it would be equal to sine theta over cosine theta. So, that is one of our basic identities. Now, let's check out cotangent theta. So, cotangent is just B over A. If we divide the numerator and the denominator by C, we'd get cosine theta divided by, cosine theta divided by sine theta. This one. And then, second theta natin, which is C over B, if we divide both the numerator and the denominator as we did before by the hypotenuse C, you'd get 1 over cosine theta. And the same with cosecant theta, what you'd get is 1 over sine theta. So, your basic identities is actually based on your trigonometric functions of a right triangle. Alright? So, balikan natin yung triangle natin. So, our right triangle. So, we have here our angles, theta, and beta. So, these two angles, kasi if we added the angles of a triangle, so if we added these three, this theta, beta, and this right angle, or the 90 degrees, what would get is 180 degrees, right? So, with that logic, therefore, adding theta and beta, what you get is 90 degrees. So, when two angles are added and they result to 90 degrees, they are called complementary angles. Alright, so just a bit of trivia. If you've ever wondered why, ano ibig sabihin ng cosine, cotangent, and ng cosecant natin, it actually came from this one. Because our theta and beta are actually complementary angles. So, if we would consider beta, so let's check the sine of beta. So, sine of beta is equal to, opposite B over hypotenuse. So, that's sine beta is equal to B over C. And B over C from our definition before is just equal to cosine theta. Diba? So, it's actually called cosine because it is the complement of that sine. So, mapapansin nyo, it's the same here for tangent beta. It is equal to B over A, which is equal to cotangent theta. And for secant beta, it is equals to C over A, which is our cosecant. So it is complementary to that secant. So if we consider, for example, sine theta, it is actually equal to cosine beta. So complementary lang siya. So we have tangent theta is equal to cotangent beta. And secant theta is equal to cosecant beta. So they're just complementary to each other. Kaya siya tinawag na cosine, cotangent, and cosecant because it is complementary to that sine, complementary to that tangent, and complementary to that secant. Kaya siya tinawag na. That's why they're called cosine, coteta, cosecant. So there you go. Okay, so our next set of identities is called Pythagorean Relations. So we have here the Pythagorean Theorem, a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. If we divide both sides by c squared, what we'd get is a over c squared, b over c squared is equals to what? Then, it would be equal to sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta is equals to 1. So, this is an identity because whatever value you place in your theta, it would still be equal to 1. So, kahit na this is 45 degrees, it would still be equal to 1. Even if this is 1,000 degrees, it would still be equal to 1. So, that is what you call an identity. So, our next identity is tangent squared theta plus 1 is equals to secant theta or secant squared theta. So, it can be, you can arrive at this identity by dividing your Pythagorean theorem by b squared, or you can, your first identity, your first Pythagorean relation, you can divide this by, so you can divide this by cosine squared theta plus cosine squared theta is equals to cosine squared theta. So, i-divide lang natin siya. So, you'd get sine squared theta over cosine squared theta plus cosine squared theta over cosine squared theta is equals to 1 over cosine squared theta. And what you'd arrive at is tangent squared theta plus 1 is equals to secant squared theta. Kasi yung 1 over cosine natin, this is your secant theta. Diba? And yung sine over cosine natin, this is your tangent. So, pwedeng dun siya galing. Or, for the third Pythagorean relation, which is 1 plus cotangent squared theta is equal to cosine squared theta. You can get this by dividing the Pythagorean theorem by a squared. Or, what you can do is, you have sine squared theta divided by sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta divided by sine squared theta is equals to 1 over sine squared theta. And it would be equal to this one. Kasi yung sine squared theta over sine squared theta natin is equal to 1. Cosine over sine natin, this is your cotangent. And then 1 over sine natin, this is your cosine. So, doon nanggaling yung Pythagorean relations natin. So, yan yung basics natin for the right triangle. Of course, ano yung formula natin for the area of a right triangle? It is just 1/2 base times height, or 1/2. In this case, in this triangle, it is a times b. So ito yung height natin. This would be your height, and this would be your base. Alright? So that's it for your right triangles and the functions and the identities in relations to right triangle. Alright, so let's proceed to general triangles. So, general triangles, so any type of triangles, pwede nating apply itong laws na to. So, the first one that we have here is the sine law. So, I know that you guys would probably remember this one. Pero what does it really mean? So, basahin muna natin. Let's read first the definition of sine law. So, in any triangle, it says here, any triangle, the ratio of any one side to the sine of its opposite angle is constant. So, it means that A over sine of this angle A is equal to B over sine B and C over sine C. So, they are equal to each other. So, constant lang siya. The same here. So, A divided by sine A is equal to B divided by sine B is equal to C divided by sine C. And that constant ratio, if you don't know, well, most of you, I think, have forgotten this, is that ratio, this one, is equal to the diameter of the circle circumscribing the triangle. So, any triangle can only be circumscribed by a single circle. So, isang circle lang ang pwedeng dumaan dito sa tatlong vertices ng triangle natin. And this ratio is equal to the diameter of that circumscribing circle. So, if you are asked maybe to compute the area of the circle circumscribing a specific triangle, pwede nyo gamitin tong sine law. So, you can use this sine law. So, I know that most of you have remembered this one. Pero, what does this value mean? So, this is just your, well, yan, diameter lang siya ng circles natin, ng circumscribing circle natin dun sa triangle na yun. Okay, so, let's proceed with cosine law. So, what is sine law? So, sine law, in any triangle ulit, so you can apply this in any type of triangle, the square of any one side equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides diminished, ibig sabihin, minus by twice their product nung other two sides natin to the cosine of its included angle. So, pag sinabing included angle, when you say included angle, it means that the angle between those two sides. So, for example, you have here our first equation. So, you have a squared, so this one, is equal to the squares of the other two sides. So, b squared plus c squared. Minus diminished by twice their product. So, 2 times b times c to the cosine of its included angle. So, the angle between b and c is a. So, you have here cosine a. So, if we're going to consider side b, so it would be b squared is equal to a squared plus c squared minus 2 times a times c times cosine b. So, cosine between these two sides, or the angle between those two sides. And if we consider this side c, so it would be c squared is equal to a squared plus b squared minus 2 times a times b times cosine of the angle between these two sides, which is c. So, that's cosine c. And if you would notice, what if itong angle c natin is actually a 90-degree angle? So, cosine 90 degrees, so wait lang. Napin natin yung calculator natin. So, let me just bring up our calculator. Give me a minute. Or give me a second. So, ayan. Wait lang. So, ito yung calculator natin. So, what if we have cosine 90? So, that's equal to 0. So, 0 siya. So, what does that mean for us? So, kung 0 to, for example, yung angle C natin is equal to 90 degrees. So, this would be 0. So, this whole term would now be equal to 0. So, ano yung matitira sa atin? We would be left with the Pythagorean Theorem. Alright, so that is our cosine law. So, it helps that you know the definition. Mahirap kasi if you're just going to memorize the formulas without knowing what they actually mean. So, it's better if you internalize the principles first rather than just memorizing these formulas. Okay? Same with your sine law. So, it's better if you understand this definition first before you memorize the formula. And of course, for sine law, you don't actually need to memorize these three formulas. Kahit na isa lang yung i-memorize nyo, it would be good enough. As long as let's say you've memorized this one, as long as you know the principles behind that formula, mapapalabas nyo rin tong dalawa na to. Alright, so that's for our sine law and cosine law. Next, we would be discussing areas of triangles. Okay, so ano ba yung pinaka-basic formula ng area ng triangle? So, the basic formula of an area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height, or 1/2 base times the altitude. So, for example, let's say this triangle. So, we're saying, we're going to use B as the base. So, what would be our height? So, our height would be this one. So, kailangan perpendicular distance to the third side, or the third, yung angle na opposite that side. So, for example, if we're going to use A as our base, so what would be our height? So, our height would be the perpendicular distance. Ito. This one would be our height. What about if we're going to use C as our base? So, if we're going to use C as our base, ito yung ating, actually hindi. Isa natin. Ito yung magiging ating height. So, yun yung basis ng 1/2 times base times height natin. So, what I'm actually presenting you is just a single principle that you can use to compute for the area. I know there are a lot of formulas to compute for areas of a triangle. For example, given base and altitude, you're going to use this one. So, 1/2 base times height. What if you're given 3 sides? So, you're going to use Heron's formula or Heron's formula. If you guys would remember that, ito yung Heron's formula natin is square root of s times s minus a times s minus b times s minus c. While yung s natin is equal to a plus b plus c over 2. 2 yan. Yan. So, yan yung Heron's formula natin. If you're given 3 sides, and you're asked to compute for the area. What if you're given 3 angles and 1 side? So, ano yung magiging area natin? You can use this formula, a squared sine b sine c to sine a. So, there are a lot of formulas to compute for an area of a triangle. But what I'm presenting you is you only need this formula or this principle, and you will be able to compute for any area of a triangle if you're going to apply this. So, let's read yung principle natin. So, the area of any triangle, again, any triangle to, is 1/2 times the product of any two sides to the sine of their included angle. So, 1/2 of the product of any two sides to the sine of their included angle. So, let's say, for a triangle, we're going to use these two sides. So, we have side B and side A. The included angle niya would be C. So, it would be 1/2 times A times B times sine C, as you can see here in our first equation. What if we're going to use side B and C? So, our included angle, or the angle between those two sides, would be A. So, the area would now be 1/2 times B times C times sine A. And similarly for this one, if we're going to use side A and C, our included angle would be B, so it would be equal to 1/2 times A times C times sine B. So, saan nanggaling yung principle na yun? It came from this principle. So, let's say we have here a triangle, and the base that we're going to use is A and B. Or rather, the sides that we're going to use is A and B, and their included angle is theta. So as you can see here, this is a right triangle. So if it is a right triangle, you can now compute for this height. Itong side na to, itong h natin. And you can use this, so sine theta, so opposite. So we have here opposite h over hypotenuse b. So sine theta is equal to h over b. And we're trying to compute for h, what we get is h is equal to b times sine theta. Diba? So if ang area ng triangle is just 1/2 times base times height, in this case, ang base natin is a, ang height natin is b sine theta. As you can see in this formula. So, bakit ko nasabi na kahit ito lang yung formula na i-memorize nyo for an area of a triangle? So, for example, dito, given ka ng 2 sides plus 1 angle. What if you're just given, let's say, given 3 sides? So, automatically, yung Heron's formula yung gagamitin nyo. But, if you know the cosine law, you're given 3 sides, A, B, C, you can now solve for an angle. And once you have that angle, pwede mo na gamitin itong formula na to. Diba? So, what if you're given 2 sides and an angle? So, you can use sine law. So, if you have 2 sides and an angle, actually, yun na rin yun eh. 2 sides and an angle, you can use this one. Diba? So, for example, what else? Given 3 angles and 1 side. So, if you're given 3 angles, what you can do is, you can use sine law. So, given ka ng 3 angles and 1 side, you will be able to compute for the length of another side. And then you can proceed with this formula to compute for the area. So, you don't need to memorize yung Heron's formula to compute the triangle. Kahit ito lang yung gamitin nyo. But if you're more comfortable with those, pwede nyo namang i-memorize yun. This is just a suggestion so that you can limit the amount of formulas that you're going to memorize. Alright, so that's for the area of a triangle. Okay, let's discuss angles. So, yung application kasi ng trigonometry natin, specifically for mechanics, you know, your statics, your dynamics, and your mechanics of deformable bodies. Sometimes, dito nagkakaroon ng maraming mistakes pagdating sa angles. So, let's review angles. So, okay, first one. So, we have 2 parallel lines. So, these 2 lines are parallel to each other. And then, you're going to bisect those 2 parallel lines by a straight line. This one, itong blue color natin. So, if you bisect that by a straight line, these angles, this one, and then this one, are equal to each other, right? So, if this is theta, this is also theta. On the other side of that angle, this one, and this one would also be equal to each other. And then this one would now be equal to 180 degrees minus theta. Same here, this is 180 degrees minus theta. Yeah. Okay, next. So, we have here a circle with a line tangent. Tapos, meron tayong line, normal naman siya, passing through the center of our circle. So, we are to compute for this angle. So, if you're going to look at this picture, siguro ang unang assumption nyo would be, you'd say that alpha is equal to 25 degrees. So, pag ganon, you need to stop and think about things. So, what you're actually going to do is try to analyze it. So, let's say, from this figure, so if I draw a straight line here, dito, we can say this angle is equal to 25 degrees. If we draw a line parallel to this line, this one is a horizontal line, we could say that these 2 angles are equal to each other, diba? And then if we're going to analyze this angle, we know that this one is a 90-degree angle. Diba? So, ito, straight line, ang angle niya is 180 degrees, right? This one is 90 degrees. This one is 25 degrees. So, ano na lang yung matitira? So, we could say that this angle and this angle are actually equal to each other, right? So, we could say that this is alpha. Now, alpha would now be equal to 90 degrees minus 25. 90 degrees minus 25 degrees. And that would be equal to 65 degrees. So, makikita nyo yung logic. Diba? So, mahirap na mag-assume kaagad. So, we got this kasi this angle would now be 90 degrees. And you already have 25 degrees. So, ima-minus lang natin ang matitira, 65 degrees. And this one, so you have here a parallel line, two parallel lines, and you're going to bisect it by a straight line. Therefore, this angle and this angle should be equal to each other. So, yung alpha natin is now equal to 25 degrees. So, another example. So, meron ulit tayong circle and then we have a line tangent to that circle. Tapos, that line has an angle of 42 degrees from the horizontal. So, ano yung angle beta natin? So, again, do not assume na yung angle beta natin will just be equal to 42. So, wrong assumption yun. So, again, similar to what we did here, we're just going to apply logic. So, if we draw a line, a straight horizontal line here, so this line is parallel to this line. So, pareho silang horizontal. We can now say that this angle, this one, is equal to 42 degrees as well. From this principle. Diba? So, if this is 42 degrees, ito 90 degrees to, therefore, on the other side, 90 degrees din to. So, 90 degrees minus 42, ano yung matitira sa atin? It is 48 degrees. And as you can notice, this one is a horizontal line, this one is a horizontal line. So, they are parallel to each other. Tapos, binisect natin siya with a straight line. Therefore, yung beta natin should also be equal to 48 degrees. So, itong beta natin is now equal to 48 degrees. Okay? So, what if maglagay tayo ulit ng angle dito? So, give me a second. Okay, what if ganito naman? So, we have another line. Resize ko lang. Let's just make this bigger so we can see more clearly. So, okay. So, we have another line tangent to our circle and it has an angle of 20 degrees to the horizontal line. This one, this horizontal line. So, we are to compute for angle alpha. So, again, same lang yung procedure natin, no? So, mag-project lang tayo dito ng horizontal line. So, this would now be 20 degrees. So, if this is 20 degrees, ano yung remaining angle natin? Or rather, ito pala yung 20 degrees natin. So, if this is 20 degrees, what would be the remaining angle? So, this would now be 70 degrees. And this 70 degrees is equal to your angle alpha. So, yung alpha natin would now be 70 degrees din. So, ganun lang. Just take it step by step. Solve it slowly. So, ganito. Another example. So, let's say you have, wait lang. Let's draw it. So, let's say this one. So, this one is theta. So, we have two lines here. Ang angle niya is, this one would be 20 degrees. And then, this one is, lakihan natin. This one is 60 degrees. So, we are to compute for angle theta. So, how are we going to do that? So, again, i-apply lang natin. Step by step tayo. So, if this is 20 degrees, if mag-project ako ng line dito, if I draw here a horizontal line, this now would be 20 degrees as well. So 23 degrees to. The remaining angle you can compute from 60 degrees. So 60 degrees minus 23 degrees, we'd get 37. So this would now be 37 degrees. And since this is a parallel line to this one, tapos bisecting a straight line, your theta would now be equal to 37 degrees din siya. So ganun lang, it's quite simple. Just take it step by step. Do not assume, especially in the board exam, the figures that they have there are not drawn to scale. So it's not it's very risky to jump into conclusions kaagad. So just take it slowly, analyze nyo muna yung figures natin and do it step by step. And apply the principles that we are teaching right now or that we are learning right now. Okay, let's try another example. So, ito very typical to na nakukuha natin sa mga problems natin sa statics. So, we have a plane surface here. Tapos, meron tayong applied force right here. So, wait lang. Ayusin natin. So, may applied force tayo dito. Yung plane natin has an inclination of, say, this is 42.5 degrees. And we're trying to find this angle. So let me just draw it out. So for example, we're trying to figure out angle theta. This one is normal to your plane surface. So how do we solve for angle theta? So solving for angle theta, what can we do? So pwede nating i-project tong angle na to. Let's just draw a straight line here. So we could now say that this angle is 42.5 degrees as well. Diba? And this one, itong angle na to, this is a 90-degree angle. So we could solve for the remaining. So just this is just 90 minus 42.5, which is equal to 47.5 degrees. Diba? And we know that this angle is also a right angle, so 90 degrees siya. So solving for theta, it is just a complement. So 90 minus 47.5 siya. Kasi dapat these three angles is should be equal to 180. Or these two angles should be equal to 90 degrees. So yung theta natin now would now be equal to 42.5 degrees. So ganun lang. Okay. Let's proceed to the next topic. So our next couple of topics would be about the application of your trigonometric principles to some of the problems that you might encounter in statics of rigid bodies or in mechanics. So our first topic under this is force components. So this is probably one of the few topics that you would encounter or discuss under statics or even in physics, how to compute force components. Okay, we'll focus on the application of your trigonometry dito sa topics natin. Hindi tayo magsasolve masyado ng statics or ng mechanics problems. So, okay. So, for our first example, we are to compute the force components of your force, which is 600 newtons, and it is inclined at an angle of 32 degrees. So, ano ba yung first components natin dito? So, for this one, we have our force components. So, let's say, first one here would be your Py, and then the second one here would be your Px. So, in computing your force components, this is actually related to a right triangle. So, pwede natin siyang gawing right triangle because this is an orthogonal. So, this is a 90-degree angle. So, pwede tayong gumawa ng triangle. So, let's draw a triangle. So, let me just take this out. So ito yung triangle natin. Our force now would be 600 newtons. Wait lang. Let's change the thickness. So this would now be 600 newtons. And this has an interior angle of 32 degrees. So yung PX natin would be this one, and our PY would be this one. So we could just apply principles ng right triangle natin. So in computing for PX and PY, so sa katawa lang yung i-apply natin, right? So we're going to apply your saw katawa. Actually, yung saw tsaka yung tawa usually is applied when you're computing for the force itself. So yung hypotenuse, yung 600 newtons. But in this case, yung sine tsaka cosine na yung apply natin. So, in computing for PY, what are we going to apply? So, ito muna i-solve natin, PY. So, or ka. In this case, pipiliin natin, kasi we're interested with sine 32 degrees, opposite, which is PY, over hypotenuse. So, we have here. Let's write it down. So, we have sine 32 degrees is equals to opposite, PY, over hypotenuse, which is 600 newtons. So, rewriting this, our PY would now be equal to 600 times sine 32 degrees. And that will be equal to, so it's equal to 317.952 newtons. Okay, what about PX? So for PX, we're going to apply cosine. So we'd have here cosine 32 degrees. So ka adjacent PX over hypotenuse 600. So we have PX over 600. Rewriting this, we'd have PX is equals to 600 cosine 32 degrees. And that will be equal to 508.829 newtons. So let's just highlight this for answer. Okay, so that's your first components. I know it's quite simple for you guys, but this is just a review and I'd like to cover everything, even the basic ones. So our next example, we're going to compute for the force itself, or the resultant force, and you have here the components, Rx and Ry. So we're computing for the resultant. So yung resultant natin would be this one. So this would be your R. Also, we're interested in the angle na inclination ng ating resultant. So again, you can consider this as a right triangle. So ito na yung magiging right triangle natin. So let me just take this out. So from this triangle, we know that our Rx is equals to 200 newtons and our Ry is equal to 300 newtons. What we're trying to find is yung resultant force natin and the angle theta. So computing for angle theta, so what we're going to use? So we could use TOA. So tangent. So solving for angle theta, that would be just tangent theta is equals to TOA. So opposite over adjacent. So that's 300 divided by 200. So solving for theta, we can actually rewrite this as theta is now equal to arctan 300 over 200. Then theta would now be equal to 56.31 degrees. All right. So what about the resultant force? So we have here, so our resultant force is your hypotenuse. So now we could actually use your Pythagorean theorem. So for the Pythagorean Theorem, it will just be equal to r square root of the squares of your components, or 200 squared plus 300 squared. Now our r would now be equal to 360.555 newtons. So that's our resultant force and the angle of inclination. So okay, you might be wondering, may shortcut ba to using our calculator or yung Caltech natin? So I'd like to show you guys how you can do this faster using your calculators. Okay, solving for the force components using your calculator techniques. So you could actually use any mode. So here I'm using mode 1. So what we're going to do is we're going to consider yung force P natin and the angle 32 degrees as your polar coordinates, or the r and the theta. So our first step, so any mode, you can use any mode. So we're going to click shift and then rectangular. Then we're going to input the coordinates. For r, it's a 600. And then shift, comma. Then for the angle theta, we have 32 degrees. And then we're going to close the parentheses and then press equal sign. And there you go. You have your x and y component. So for the x component, you have 508. And then for the y component, you have 370. So it's quite simple, diba? There's actually a better way of doing this para lang mas maganda yung presentation niya. So click natin CA. We're going to change the mode to stat mode. So mode 3. Then you can actually choose any of this. Pero you could actually just click CA. Also make sure that your angle is on degrees, not on radians. So dapat naka-degrees siya. Same kanina din, naka-degrees din siya. So naka-stat mode tayo. So same procedure, rectangular, 600, comma, 32 degrees, close the parentheses, and then equal sign. So mas better lang yung presentation dito pag naka-stat mode ka. So you have your x and y component. So there you go, force components. Paano kapag we're interested in the resultant? So if we're interested in the resultant, so naka-stat mode pa rin ako. CA lang natin to. Clear natin yung screen. What we're going to do is we're going to use our components as your rectangular coordinates. And then we're going to look for the polar coordinates r and theta. So our procedure, shift, and then pol. And then we're going to input the coordinates. So x tapos y muna. So for the x-axis, we have 200, comma. And then for the y, we have 300. Close the parentheses, equal sign. There you go. So you have your resultant, 360. And then you have the angle, theta, 56. Pero meron pang, this is actually wrong with regards dun sa sign ng theta natin. Bakit? Kasi the proper way or the standard way of measuring your angles is actually, so dito tayo, tingin tayo dito. So the proper way of measuring, or the standard way of measuring your angles, is you're going to measure your angle from the x-axis, from your positive side of your x-axis, and then you're going to measure it counterclockwise. If you do that, you'd get a positive angle. But if you measure the angle clockwise from your positive x-axis, you'd get a negative angle. So if you're going to look at our example here, yung angle natin was measured clockwise from the x-axis. So this should be negative. And you notice this, yung ry natin, if this is the origin of our Cartesian plane, yung x and y axis natin, dapat negative to, di ba? So let's try and change yung y component natin, yung 300, into negative. Lagyan natin negative sign. And then click equal sign, and then notice na yung angle theta natin would now be negative. So para tama na yung in sign convention ng angles natin. So that's how you can use your calculator for solving this type of problems faster. Sa board exam kasi every minute counts. So you want to be able to do this a bit faster than usual. And there you go. Okay, next example, force components for that. So we're going to compute for the components of force P, which is 200 newtons. So again, we're going to use our calculator techniques in solving this. So we're going to solve for Py and Px. So again, yung calculo is under stat mode. And then since I'm going to compute for since I'm looking for the components, we're going to use rec and then type in our coordinates. So our r is 200 and our theta is 58 degrees. So click equals and there you go. So you have your force components. For Px, you have 105, and then for your Py, you have 169. Now, you'd notice na hindi tama yung signs natin because your Px should have been a negative sign or should have a negative sign since it is going to the left from the origin of our x and y axis. Diba? So, what can we do para maging negative siya? So, yung standard way of measuring your angles, diba sabi ko, you need to measure it counterclockwise from your positive x-axis. So, ano yung magiging angle na to? So, it is just 180 degrees minus 58. So, that's 122 degrees. So, we're just going to change the angle here. Instead of 58, we're going to use 122. And then press equal again. So, makikita nyo yung x component natin is now negative 105. So, another way of doing this is that you could measure the angle coming from here. So, it is clockwise from your x-axis. So, clockwise tayo. And this would be 180 plus 58, which is 238 degrees. As I said earlier, if you're measuring clockwise from your positive x-axis, your angle has a negative sign. So again, we're just going to change instead na 122. We're going to use negative 238. And you'd get basically the same thing. Okay. So let's do another example. So we have here another example of solving for force component. So we have force P that is 400 newtons, and it is measured from the negative side of your x-axis to be 90 degrees below. So again, we're going to solve for the components, yung Px natin and Py natin. So we're actually going to use same method for your calculator. So clear natin to. So again, shift, rectangle, and then let's input our coordinates, our polar coordinates. For our r, it is 400. And then for theta, that will be our angle, 19 degrees. Press equal. There you go. So makuha natin yung force components natin. X and Y components with completely disregarding any signs. So what if we're going to need to follow the proper sign convention? So this is especially important if we have multiple forces. Tapos we're going to compute for the resultant or something like that. So kailangan maintain natin yung proper sign convention natin. So again, standard way of measuring your angle. So you need to come from the positive side of your x-axis. So coming from the positive side, we're going to measure this angle, and this is 180 degrees plus 19 degrees, which is equal to positive 199 degrees. So if we input that in our calculator, so 199 positive equals So we're still going to get the same components, pero tama na yung signs natin. So they are both negative, as you can see in our x and y axis. So below the origin going down, and then going towards the left side from the origin yung x-axis natin. So they're really supposed to be negative. So let me just write it down here. So our px is actually negative 378.207 newtons. And then our py will now become negative 130.227 newtons. We could do this another way. So we can use, or we could measure the angle clockwise from the positive x-axis. And that is 180 minus 19, and that's equal to 161. So if you're measuring clockwise from your positive x-axis, this is supposed to be negative. So let's change the angle here. Let's use negative 161, and we're supposed to get the same value. So yeah. Okay. So that's it for our force components. Let's move on to the next topic. Okay, next example, force components for that. So we're going to compute for the components of force P, which is 200 newtons. So again, we're going to use our calculator techniques in solving this. So we're going to solve for Py and Px. So again, yung calculo is under stat mode. And then since I'm going to compute for since I'm looking for the components, we're going to use rec and then type in our coordinates. So our r is 200 and our theta is 58 degrees. So click equals, and there you go. So you have your force components. For px, you have 105, and then for your py, you have 169. Now, you'd notice na hindi tama yung signs natin because your px should have been a negative sign or should have a negative sign since it is going to the left from the origin of our x and y axis. Diba? So, what can we do para maging negative siya? So, yung standard way of measuring your angles, diba sabi ko, you need to measure it counterclockwise from your positive x-axis. So, ano yung magiging angle na to? So it is just 180 degrees minus 58. So that's 122 degrees. So we're just going to change the angle here. Instead of 58, we're going to use 122. And then press equal again. So makikita nyo yung x component natin is now negative 105. So another way of doing this is that you could measure the angle coming from here. So it is clockwise from your x-axis, so clockwise tayo. And this would be 180 plus 58, which is 238 degrees. As I said earlier, if you're measuring clockwise from your positive x-axis, your angle has a negative sign. So again, we're just going to change instead na 122. We're going to use negative 238. And you'd get basically the same thing. Okay. So let's do another example. Okay, let's apply the principles that we have learned so far. So we are to solve for r, alpha, and beta. So we have here force P that is 500. So unitless siya. Kasi we're just interested in its trigonometry. So yung P natin is 33 degrees from the horizontal. So this is 33 degrees. And then we have Q here that is equals to 800, and it is 28 degrees from the horizontal. So we are to compute for R, alpha, and then beta. Okay, so what are we going to apply here? So are we going to apply the Pythagorean Theorem? So we can't do that because this is not a right triangle. So what we're going to use is the sine law and the cosine law. So it actually depends kung ano yung makukuha natin na mga variables dito sa figure natin. Kung mas appropriate ba or mas madali ba na gamitan yung sine law or the cosine law. Okay, so let's look at the figure. Since given yung direction and the angles of these two arrows or these two forces, we can now compute for this angle. Diba? So how do we compute for that angle? So from the principles that we discussed earlier, if I draw a horizontal line here, this angle must be 33 degrees as well. So dapat equal siya itong dalawa nito. And this one should be equal to this one as well. So this should be 28 degrees. So therefore, the angle between P and Q, so pag-add lang natin, 33 plus 28, so that's 61 degrees. Okay, so from the figure, what do we have? So we have here two sides and the angle in between. So from the cosine and the sine law, cosine law would be most appropriate for this type, where you have two sides and angle in between. So for the cosine law, we're going to compute for the other side, the unknown side, which is r. So that should be r squared, and it should be equal to the two sides, the square of two sides. So that's 500 squared plus 800 squared minus twice or 2 times 500 times 800 cosine the angle in between, which is 61 degrees. And what would be our r? So our r would now be equal to 708.627. Okay, since we know what r is, we're gonna apply sine law without problem. Kanina kasi, we still don't know what the other side is or the third side is. So if we apply sine law, dalawa yung magiging ano natin. For example, so we do know 61, the angle between P and Q, which is 61 degrees. So that will be R over sine 61 degrees is equal to, let's say here, P over sine alpha. So dalawa yung unknown natin, yung R tsaka yung alpha. Or if we choose this one, 800 over sine beta. So magiging ano natin, beta and then R. So kaya ang inuna natin gamitan is the sine law. Kasi what we have here is two sides and an included angle. So pag ganyan yung situation natin, use cosine right away. And then now that we know what R is, we can now apply sine law without problem. So for the sine law, so let's use alpha first. So we have here alpha all over sine, or rather, sorry. This should be 500 sine alpha. And this is equal to 800 sine beta. And then lastly, we have R, which is 708.627 all over sine 61 degrees. So from this, we can now solve for alpha and beta. So we could do this using shift solve. And our alpha from this one should be equal to 38 degrees point 106. And then our beta would be equal to 80.894 degrees. So there you go. So, ang tawag dito? You can do this, you can solve these angles by using your shift solve. But if your calculators, sometimes it takes a long time, the process. So, medyo mas sayang yung oras. What you could do is you could simplify your equations and then i-direct compute nyo na lang sa calculator nyo. For example, let's just first highlight this or final answer. So, for example, if you're solving for alpha, our alpha is equal to arc sine. So that's 500 sine 61 degrees all over our r, which is 708,627. So you could solve alpha that way. And then we have our beta. So sine, this is 800 sine 61 degrees all over 708,627. So, ganyan lang. So, cross-multiply lang natin yung equation. Di ba? Okay. Is there a simpler method to solve this? So, yes. So, may calcutech din tayo for this one. So, I'll show you. Let's minimize this on the other side. Palitin lang natin to ng konti para magkaka. Okay? Okay, so for the shortcut method, so we're going to use our calculator again. So, from the problem, what was given is itong dalawang side, which is 500 and 800. And then yung direction niya, which is 33 degrees from the horizontal, and this one is 28 degrees from the horizontal. So, from those given, we can compute the angle between those two sides. So, yun yung meron tayo initially. And we are asked to compute for the r and the angles alpha and beta. So using our calculator, what we can do here is we're going to use the complex mode, which is mode 2. So complex tayo. So we have here 800. So we have 800 minus 500. Angle, and the interior angle or the angle between those two sides is 61. So angle 61. Then press equal, and what you'd get is the rectangular form. So what we actually need is yung polar form. So to do that, you just click apps and then press 1. And then press equal. So there you go. So yung 708 natin, which is our R right here. And then arrow key, right arrow key. So you have negative 38 degree for alpha. So what about if you want to compute for beta? So if you want to compute for beta, wait, hindi ko pala na-explain. So, how did I know that this angle, yung negative 38, is our angle alpha? So, from the first step natin, or first step a while ago was that, wait lang. Let's bring up our calculator. So, our first step was that binigyan natin ng angle is yung 500. So, ano yung angle katapat ng 500 natin? It is alpha. Kaya yung nasolve natin angle kanina, which is, ulitin pala natin. Wait lang. Yung nasolve natin angle is alpha. So, what about if we want to solve for beta? So, babalik na rin lang natin yung ginawa natin. So, from this, so, what we're going to do is 500 minus 800 angle 61 degrees equal sign. So you'd get the rectangular form. But what we need is the polar coordinates. So we're going to click apps and then press 1. Then click equal sign again. So our R is still the same, but the angle is now different. So this angle is now your beta. So that's negative 80. So again, yung angle natin dito, which is negative 80, kaya siya beta because what we used here or what we gave the angle to is yung 800 natin. So ano yung angle sa tapat ng 800 natin? It is beta. So kaya yung nasolve natin yung angle kanina is beta, which is negative 80.894 degrees. So, mas magandang gamitin itong method na to kasi ang dami na nating na-solve using just one operation instead of going through all these things. Di ba? So, it's quite simple. What I would suggest is that you practice this para ma-master nyo yung Caltech natin for this type of problems. Okay, so another example. So this is a type of problem that you would usually encounter in mechanics or under statics of rigid bodies. So usually, lumalabas sa board exam and you will be asked to compute for the reactions at A, B, D, and C. And to be able to do that, you usually need, or what you need is the angles, and this one, yung H natin, para makapag-moment tayo. So to be able to do that, first, we're going to connect the centers of our two circles. So connect natin siya. And we can define this line because we know the radius of our circles. So we have, for the bigger circle, we have 500 mm. And then for the smaller circle, we have a diameter of 300 mm. So this would be, this one is 250 mm. And then the other one is 150 mm. Now we're trying to solve for h, diba? So, we basically know, alam natin itong distance ito. So this is just 250. So yung radius ng circle natin. So the next thing that we need to know is this height. So this is 250. Etong y natin, this is what we're trying to find out para ma-solve natin yung h natin, diba? Okay, so I've already drawn our triangle. So like I said earlier, for us to be able to compute for h, what we need to compute is yung y. So ito yung triangle natin. Let's label this one, this side of the triangle as x, and this one is the side of this side of the triangle as y. And then we have angle theta here. Bakit sinama ko yung angle theta here? Kasi when you're computing for the reaction at point D, you'd need this angle as well. So for us to be able to do that, first, so meron tayong right triangle. So yun lang, ang given lang natin, what we know right now is the hypotenuse. Yun lang yung alam natin. We don't know this angle, we don't know x, and we don't know y. But looking at our figure, we can solve for x. Diba? So how are we going to solve for x? So this side has a radius of 250 mm. Diba? And then this one has a radius of, again, 150 mm. So looking at this, straight line lang siya. Ito, dapat 150 mm lang din siya. Right? And the total length is 700. So, masasolve natin yung x. Our x is now equal to, so 700 minus 250 minus 150. So, yung x natin would be equal to 300 mm. So, now that we know x, so isulat natin dito yung x. So, this is 300 mm. So, now that we know x, we can now solve for y by just using our Pythagorean Theorem. So, let's use our Pythagorean Theorem. So, solving for y, or y now is equal to square root of 250 plus 150 squared minus 300 squared. So our y now is equals to 264.575 mm. Okay, so from that, we can solve for our h. So our h is equals to 250 plus y, which is 264.575. And that's equals to 514.575 mm. So that's our answer for the sample problem. Now what about our theta? So from our solving for our theta, what we could use here is we can either use sine or cosine. So pag sine, so opposite over hypotenuse. Pag cosine, adjacent over hypotenuse. Right? What I would suggest that you use cosine. Why? Kasi mas madali natin, mas sure tayo, sure ako na yung x natin is 300 mm. Because the computation of that is quite simple. Compared to y, baka kasi magkaroon ka ng mistake sa pag-input ng data sa calculator kasi mas mahaba yung equation natin for y or yung formula natin for y. So, mas safe na gamitan yung cosine because we're going to use x. So, solving for theta, so we're going to use cosine. So, that would be 300 all over 150 or hypotenuse plus 150. So, our theta now is equals to 41.41 degrees. So, yeah, that's our final answer, or that's the theta for this problem. So you probably encountered this type of problems still under the first subject. Typically, kasi yung mechanics or the statics and dynamics usually falls on the first subject, yung MSTE natin. So yeah, let's try another problem. Similar problem, pero this time 3 yung ating circles or yung cylinders natin. Also, we have here 3 cylinders with different diameters. So, the biggest one is 500. The second is 400. And then the smallest is 300. And then we are to solve for h. So again, if you have this type of problem, the best thing to do is that you connect the centers of your cylinders, of your circles. So, connect natin to. Now, we know these sides, makakabuo tayo ng triangle. We can compute for the sides of our, wait lang, ayaw dumiretso. Let's try this. Ayaw, ano ba yan? Wait lang ha. Let's try and draw a line, a straight line. So, yeah. So, itong line na to, this is not a horizontal line. This is an inclined line. So, okay. So, from this, alam natin yung diameters. So, we could compute for the sides of our triangle. So, for this one, we have 250 to. This one is 150. Again, this one, 150. This one is 200. This one is 250 as well. And this one would be 200. So, alam natin yung sides ng triangle natin. Diba? So, we have this triangle. And we're trying to solve for h. Now, how do we approach solving for h? So, ang mga given natin na, yung una makikita natin na heights is that, so we know this height. So, this is 250. We also know this one, which is 200. We know this one, which is 150. So, from that given alone, how are we going to solve for h? So, h natin, we could say that it is 250 plus 150 plus this height between the two centers, and that will be your h, diba? So, given that, ano yung una natin mo solve from that triangle? So let me take out that triangle first. So wait lang. So that triangle, let's say, i-drawing ko na lang ulit dito. So ito yung triangle natin. And let's place the side. So this one would be 400. And this side is 350. And on the bottom side, this 450. Okay, we need to figure out this angle. So let's name this angle as angle theta. So ito, angle theta. So, ano yung pwede natin gamitin to solve for angle theta? So what we use is that, so you can't use Pythagorean Theorem because it's not a right triangle. You can't use Sine Law because you don't have any angles. We don't know any angles. What we could use is the cosine law. So using the cosine law, we're interested in theta. So what we're going to use is this side, yung 350. Opposite are theta. So that's 350 squared. It should be equal to the sum of the square of the two sides. 400 squared plus 450 squared minus twice the two sides, 400 times 450 cosine theta. And then shift solve natin, we will be able to solve for theta, which is 48.19 degrees. So meron tayong theta. So okay, we know theta. The next thing we're going to do is so katulad ng yung analogy na binigay ko sa inyo kanina. So we know this 3 radiuses. So this is 150, this is 200, this is 250, right? The only thing that's missing here is this height, so that we could solve for h. Or this height. Para ma-solve natin yung h, right? But it's easier if we consider this side. Kasi alam natin yung theta. Why is it important that we know theta? Kasi kukunin natin, we're going to find the perpendicular distance from this center to the peak, to the vertex of our triangle. So to do that, we need this and this. So if you notice, magkakaroon tayo ng right triangle. So let's draw that out para mas ma-visualize nyo. So if you draw a straight line from here, I need to know this angle. So let's name that angle as angle alpha. So I could draw that triangle. So i-drawing natin yung triangle na yan. So ito yung triangle natin. So we know this distance. Itong distance na to. This is just 250 plus 200. Ay, hindi pala. Ito pala yung alam natin. So this is 250 plus 200. So that is just 450. So that's 450. And then this height, so we also know that height. It is just 250 minus 200. So that's equals to 50. And we're trying to look for angle alpha. So this is a right triangle. So pwede natin gamitin yung sa katawan natin. So solving for angle alpha, you can use sine alpha is equals to opposite over hypotenuse. So, shift solve lang natin. Masasolve natin yung angle alpha, which is equals to 6.379 degrees. So, from that, what we're interested in is this height. Itong height na to. Diba? And you would notice that meron tayong right triangle dito. And in that right triangle, itong angle na to, let's name this angle beta. And we can solve for angle beta because we know theta and we know alpha. So yung angle beta natin, let's solve for angle beta. This is equals to theta minus alpha. So that's 48.19 minus 6.379 degrees. So our beta now would be equal to 41.81 degrees. And let's draw our triangle para mas ma-visualize natin. So from this triangle, we know na alam na natin yung beta. What's the other thing that we know? So from this triangle, we know the hypotenuse, which is just 250 plus 150. So that's 400. Right? And what we're trying to solve for is this one, yung y natin. Itong height na to, y. And since this is a right triangle, we can now solve for y using our sine law. So let's solve for our y. So that's just sine 41.81 or beta is equals to opposite y over hypotenuse 400. So shift solve lang natin ulit. Our y would now be equal to 266.667. Okay. Since alam na natin yung y natin, we can now solve for h. Yung h natin is just equals to 250 plus y plus 150. So now our h is equals to 666.667. There we go. So that's our final answer for this sample problem. Okay, so for our next sample problem, so we have a trapezoid here, and we're trying to find the value of x. So this type of problem, you can usually encounter this applied to mechanics, even in strength of materials, structural theories, usually as loading conditions. So this is your uniformly varying loads, kadalasan. So the way to approach this is that what we're going to consider is the triangle. This triangle. Kasi if we're going to use triangle, we can use similar triangles or ratio and proportion. So in this triangle, this would be our h. And this one, itong height na to, would now be equal to 20, or rather 30 minus 20, so that's 10. And then this one would be 35 minus 20. Wait, let's draw that better. So 35, whoa, sorry. 35 minus 20, which is 15. So we have that triangle. So we can now solve for x using similar triangles. So how do we do that? If x, for x, we have a height of 10, and that is proportional when the base is 60, height is 15. So you can now solve for x, which is 40. So, meron tayong calcu technique when solving ratio and proportions. So what we could do is, wait, let me bring up our calculator. Yeah. So using our calculator, what we do is we use the stat mode, so that's 3. And then we choose linear, that's 2. Then you'd get this table. When you get this table, you're just going to input the values. So the first one, so what we're actually going to consider is the trapezoid itself. So when x is 0, our y would be equal to 20. So let's input 20 here. And then for the next one, when x is 60, our y would be 35. Press equal sign. So that's it. And then you press AC or CA. So you don't have to worry because hindi naman siya na-delete. You could access this again. You could access it again by clicking apps and then number 2, data. So lalabas siya ulit doon. Then just click CA again. So what we're trying to figure out is x when y is equals to 30. Diba? To do that, so yung y natin is 30. And then click apps. And then choose regression or 8. And then choose the x hat or number 4 para ma-solve natin yung x value. And then press equal. So there you go. Yung x natin would now be equal to 40. So I think using the calculator technique is much better than doing yung mano-manong computation. Why? Kasi you could make mistakes here using this method. Kasi baka instead of using 10, what you might use is 30. Instead of 15, what you might use is 35. So, yun yung mga sources of error na pwede nyo ma-encounter when doing the manual solution. But if you're going to use your calculator, it's much safer, much faster, less probability of errors. So, try to practice that when solving for this type of problems. Okay? Okay, for our next sample problem, we have a transmission tower. So we're to find theta, A, and B. So typically, this is under truss analysis. So still under statics. So what we need to solve for with regards to trigonometry or relevant to our topic, which is trigonometry, is we need to solve this angle and the length A and the length B for us to be able to solve the forces in the members of this truss. So how do we do that? So the first thing that we could solve for is itong angle theta natin. So how are we going to solve that? So pwede natin gamitin tong right triangle na to to be able to solve for angle theta. But we need this distance. So how are we going to solve for that distance? So itong triangle natin na to. So highlight ko lang. Yeah. So we need this distance. So we could actually solve for that quite easily. Kasi we know the base. So pag transmission towers kasi, they are symmetrical to each other. So we know the base, which is 5 meters. And we know the top portion, which is 2.1 meter. Now, if we're going to subtract 2.1 meter from 5 meters, what we'd be left with is the total distance nito at saka nito, right? And then you can just divide it by 2 and you get this distance. So that is, so let's use our calculator. So that's 5 minus 2.1 divided by 2. So you'd be left with 1.45. So this is 1.45 meters. So okay. So we could use our Sokotawa in this, solving for angle theta. So what do we have? So alam natin itong height ng right triangle natin, which is 9 meters. We know the base. And then we're looking for angle theta. So what we're going to use is tangent. Towa, opposite over adjacent. So tangent theta, opposite 9 meters over adjacent 1.45 meters. And solving for theta, we get 80.848 degrees. Okay, next we're going to solve for A and B. So for A and B, yung X natin would be the width, and the Y natin would be the distance from the bottom. So we're going to use the same function that we used from our earlier example. So mapapansin nyo, they are proportional. So, kasi equal to. So each layer has a height of 3 meters. So equal lang sila. So this length, yung 5 meters natin, is proportional to this length. So we can use our regression function. Kaya yung ginamit natin kanina. So CA natin, we're going to use stat mode again. So we choose 3 for stat mode. And then linear tayo ulit. That is 2. So ano yung alam natin? When X is 5, yung width natin, ano yung Y natin? So our Y is 0. And then, when our X is 2.1 meters, so that's 2.1 meters, our Y, or the distance from the bottom, is 9. So yun yung alam natin. That's from the problem. So what we're trying to look for is yung distance ng A, or rather yung width sa A, yung width A, and width B. So to do that, CA tayo. And then, ano yung Y natin for A? So that has a distance of 3 meters from the bottom. And we're trying to solve for X. So apps tayo, regression, 8. And then we're going to choose 4, yung X natin. And then press equals. So makakuha natin yung A natin, which is equals to 4.033. And then, if we're going to look for B, CA tayo ulit. So our B, ano yung magiging distance from the bottom natin kapag B? So it's 6. So again, apps, regression, choose 4, the equal sign. So ito na yung B natin. So our B now is equals to 3.067. So this is both in meters. So highlight natin yung ating answers. Ayan. So you could actually check this. Pwede nyo manumanuhin yung computation natin. So, from this equation, when we solve this, so, pwede nating isolve yung A natin by using these triangles. So, itong triangle natin na to, in the long right triangle natin dyan, if we're going to solve for A na mano-mano. So, we could solve for this, itong distance na to, kasi alam natin yung angle theta. So, once you are able to solve for angle theta, you're just going to subtract this length. So, dalawa to, times 2 to, 2 or 5 meters. So, how do we do that? So, CA natin, mode 1. So, from 5 meters, we're going to subtract 3 over tangent, what's our theta? It is 80 0.848. And then you have to multiply this by 2. Kasi dalawa yung triangle natin. Dalawa yung right triangle natin. Dalawa ta. Kaya multiply natin siya by 2. And what you get is the same value. So, meron lang. Mas madali lang if we're going to use our calculator techniques. So, yeah. So, that's, I think that's it for today for the application ng trigonometric principles for problems in mechanics. All right.